So I want you to imagine standing on a muddy riverbank. It's a crisp autumn day, and if you just close your eyes, the very first thing that hits you is the smell. It's this sharp, metallic tang of cold, moving water, and it's mixing with this deep, earthy scent of like century-old mud that is finally being exposed to the sun for the first time.
Oh, yeah, that smell of exposed riverbed is unmistakable.
Right, it's so distinct. And if you listen, you notice what you're not hearing. You don't hear that low mechanical hum of turbines. You don't hear the roar of water just slamming into a concrete spillway. You just hear the river, just a continuous, unbroken sound of water finding its natural channel. You are standing on the banks of the Klamath River in the fall of 2024, and for the first time in 100 years, you're looking at a river that is running completely free.
It's honestly a profound image to start with. And, it's not just the water that's moving either, because if you look closely into those newly carved channels, nosing right past the muddy footprints where these massive concrete hydroelectric dams used to stand, you see fall-run Chinook salmon.
It's incredible.
I mean, after generations of a total insurmountable blockade, they're actually swimming home.
That specific visual, the fish returning to waters their ancestors literally haven't touched since the 1920s. That's the starting point for our deep dive today. But I want to be really clear right off the bat for everyone listening. This is not just some feel-good, isolated story about a river getting cleaned out.
Oh, no, definitely not.
We are using a massive stack of source material today to track a much larger systemic shift. We've got this incredibly detailed dossier compiled by a guy named Nick McKenzie, who is a former U.S. Forest Service forester. He actually works in the carbon offset market now. We're also looking at deep investigative reports from ProPublica and Carbon Plan. We've got some deep dives into state healthcare policy and actual data from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Yeah, we have a ton of ground to cover. And our mission today, using all these sources, is to basically trace the closing chapter of a very long, often brutal story about survival and return. Because this is a timeline that begins with historical trauma, state-sponsored violence, and literally hidden secret treaties.
Which is still wild to me that they were literally hidden.
Right, it's insane. But it brings us all the way to a modern-day reality where Native communities in California are actively, structurally regaining their autonomy. We are tracking how people who were systematically managed off of their ancestral lands are now utilizing incredibly complex modern financial mechanisms to buy that land back and actually govern it.
Yes, we're going to get into the mechanics of a massive 47,000-acre land-back deal. We're going to get really deep into the weeds of how tribes are using the highly technical and honestly fiercely debated world of carbon offset revenue to fund these buybacks.
The carbon stuff is fascinating.
It really is.
Yeah.
And we'll explore how tribes are now co-managing federal forests, reintroducing ancient fire practices. Plus, we'll trace how this new sovereignty isn't just about land. We're going to look at a small gaming tribe in the Sierra foothills that took its revenue and built a state-of-the-art health clinic for its entire surrounding town.
It is a sweeping arc, for sure. But, we also need to set some parameters for this conversation up front. We're examining an arc of genuine, regained autonomy here, but we have to look at it with a critical eye.
Right, it's not all perfect.
Exactly. This process is uneven. There are fierce, highly technical debates over the climate accounting that funds some of this stuff. There are major questions about the wealth divide between different tribes. And, there are lingering doubts about the long-term political durability of these new state and federal partnerships. So we are going to name those doubts honestly as we go.
Exactly. So as you listen today, I want you to just hold a specific question in the back of your mind. What does it actually take, mechanically and legally, to recover not just a physical piece of dirt, but the institutional authority to manage it? Like, how do you reverse a century of policy that was literally designed to erase your presence?
Well, to answer that, we really have to start by looking at the physical erasure and then the physical restoration. Let's go back to the Klamath River and that historic milestone of 2024. The removal of the 4 lower Klamath dams. That's Copco number 1, Copco number 2, Iron Gate, and J.C. Boyle.
The sheer scale of this just cannot be overstated. This is the largest dam removal project in United States history, period.
Yeah.
By taking down these 4 structures, roughly 420 miles of historical salmon habitat were suddenly reopened.
420 miles, just incredible.
It's massive. But okay, before we talk about the fish, I actually want to play devil's advocate and push back on the premise a little bit here.
Okay, lay it on me.
Well, we are in the middle of a global climate crisis, right? The mandate of the 21st century is to transition away from fossil fuels. So how on earth do the state and the federal government justify spending hundreds of millions of dollars to tear down 4 zero-emission hydroelectric power plants? I mean, doesn't that fundamentally contradict all our clean energy goals?
Yeah, that is exactly the right question to ask because on paper, if you just read a headline, it seems totally counterintuitive. But when you look at the mechanics of these specific dams, the clean energy argument just completely falls apart.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, first off, these were not massive Hoover-style dams that were providing vast amounts of power to millions of homes. Not at all. They were aging, incredibly inefficient run-of-river dams. Combined, all 4 of them generated a tiny fraction, like less than 2% of the utility company Pacificor's overall power portfolio.
Wait, less than 2%.
Yeah, negligible. And they didn't provide irrigation water for agriculture. They didn't provide flood control. They were basically just sitting there.
Okay, so their output was basically a rounding error for the utility. But they were still generating some power, right? What forced the utility's hand to actually spend the money to tear them down? Because, I mean, power companies don't usually just walk away from active infrastructure out of the goodness of their hearts.
No, they certainly don't. And it came down to a mechanism called FERC relicensing. So FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, they issue licenses for hydroelectric dams, usually for a period of about 50 years.
Okay.
Now, these Klamath dams were built way back in the early 20th century. So that was long before modern environmental laws, like the Endangered Species Act or the Clean Water Act even existed. When their 50-year license finally expired in the mid-2000s, Pacificor had to apply to the federal government for a new one.
Ah, I see where this is going. Under modern laws, you can't just block a major river and let the salmon go totally extinct.
Precisely. Under modern federal law, to get that new license, Pacificor would have been legally required to retrofit all 4 of those dams with modern, highly complex fish ladders to allow for salmon passage.
Which I imagine is not cheap.
Not at all. When the engineers and the accountants at Pacificor ran the numbers, the cost of building those massive fish ladders far exceeded the economic value of the tiny amount of electricity the dams were actually producing. It was quite literally cheaper for the utility company to just surrender the dams and remove them than to bring them up to modern environmental code.
Wow. Okay, so that is a critical mechanism to understand. The environmental regulations themselves actually changed the fundamental economic math for the utility. But I don't want to give the impression here that this was just some, quiet corporate accounting decision, because the utility didn't just happily surrender overnight.
Oh, no, not at all. This is where the source material is incredibly clear. Those dams came down because of a relentless, highly sophisticated, decades-long campaign that was authored by the Yurok, the Karuk, the Hoopa Valley, and the Klamath tribes.
Yeah, this wasn't just standing on a road holding a sign.
Exactly. They didn't just protest on the riverbank. I mean, they traveled across the Atlantic to the shareholder meetings of Pacificor's parent company in Scotland to disrupt them. They leveraged the Clean Water Act to force state regulatory agencies to deny crucial permits.
Right.
They basically built this massive coalition of commercial fishermen, conservationists, and high-powered legal teams to make keeping those dams an absolute public relations and financial nightmare for the utility.
It was basically an exercise in maximizing leverage, and the physical engineering of the actual removal was a colossal undertaking by the Klamath River Renewal Corporation.
Yes.
I mean, just think about what is sitting behind a 100-year-old dam.
It's terrifying, honestly.
And it's not just water. It's a century's worth of trapped, highly toxic, algae-filled sediment. You can't just, blow a hole in the concrete with dynamite. You'd unleash this catastrophic mudslide that would suffocate literally every living thing downstream all the way to the ocean.
Yeah, the mechanics of the drawdown were fascinating. They had to slowly, meticulously lower those reservoirs over months. This allowed an estimated 5 to 7 million cubic yards of sediment to flush out in a very controlled, calculated manner.
5 to 7 million cubic yards. That's hard to even picture.
Right. And they timed it perfectly during high winter flows when the river actually had the natural power and volume to carry all that silt safely out to the ocean.
And the ecological response has just been staggering. I mean, our sources highlight that within weeks of the final dam sections being removed in the fall of 2024, fall run Chinook were actively documented, spawning in tributaries above the former dam sites.
It gives you chills.
It does. For a century, that biological pathway was a solid concrete wall.
Yeah.
but the instinct of the fish survived the century.
And we actually have the data to back this up now. By December 2025, a one-year monitoring update by this conservation group called CalTrout showed salmon steadily, persistently surging deep into the newly opened basin. But, here is the deeper shift. Historically, if there's science being done on the Klamath River, it was state or federal scientists coming in, taking their measurements, and then basically telling the tribes what was going to happen to their own river.
Right. The tribes were essentially just the subjects of the policy. They had no agency.
Today, that paradigm has completely inverted. Tribal biologists are the ones out there running the sonar cameras. They are the ones tagging the fish, taking the water samples, and authoring the actual data. They are working as absolute peers alongside the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and the federal biologists at NOAA.
That is a massive transfer of intellectual authority. The tribes aren't just petitioning the state for information anymore. They are generating the foundational science that the state relies on. But let's look at the science they are actually doing, because taking the dams out is really just step one.
Right. It's not a magic wand.
Exactly.
Okay.
I want to be very clear about the survival rates here. Seeing fish above the dams is an incredible visual, but does that mean the ecosystem is quote-unquote fixed?
Not at all. And the tribal biologists are actually the very first ones to point this out. First-year returns are an emotional victory, a massive milestone, but long-term outcomes are heavily dependent on some really specific, volatile water quality metrics.
Like the sediment we were talking about.
Exactly. The monitoring teams are tracking exactly where that sediment is settling in the riverbed. Because if too much fine sediment covers the gravel beds, the salmon can't lay their eggs. They need clean gravel. They are also constantly tracking dissolved oxygen levels, which can crash rapidly when too much organic matter decays in the water.
And then, of course, there's the temperature.
Oh, temperature is the big one. The main stem of the Klamath River is warming up, partly due to broader climate change. And salmon are cold water fish. If the water gets too warm, it becomes physically lethal for them.
Yeah, they get super stressed.
Right, their immune systems drop, and they become susceptible to these massive disease outbreaks, like the terrible, catastrophic fish kills we saw in the Klamath back in the early 2000s. So while the pathway is technically open now, the salmon's long-term survival depends entirely on finding cold water.
Which means we can't just look at the river channel itself. The water in the river is a direct product of the land surrounding it. If the entire watershed is degraded, the river is going to be degraded. So if you actually want to save the salmon, you have to control the forests that feed the river.
That is the perfect transition into the next massive phase of this story, because it takes us from the water straight up into the hills. It takes us to Blue Creek and the actual mechanics of the largest land-back deal in California history.
Right. So in May and June of 2025, the title to roughly 47,000 acres of land in the Klamath Basin was officially conveyed to the Yurok tribe. I just want to say that again. 47,000 acres.
To really give you a sense of scale on that, the Yurok Reservation for a long, long time was essentially just this narrow, 1-mile-wide strip of land running on either side of the lower Klamath River. This single acquisition roughly doubled their total land base, bringing it up to around 100,000 acres.
That's like adding a small country to your backyard. But this wasn't some quick real estate transaction on Zillow, right?
No. This was a multi-decade, highly strategic assembly of properties.
Right. Our sources detailed that the negotiations began way back in 2002. A group called the Western Rivers Conservancy, or WRC, they basically stepped in as a conservation intermediary. And they began negotiating to acquire massive tracts of commercial timberland from a company called the Green Diamond Resource Company.
Yeah. Green Diamond is a massive industrial timber outfit, and they own these vast, steep watersheds that fed directly down into the Klamath. In 2009, the WRC and the Yurok tribe formed a formal strategic partnership. The strategy was for the WRC to essentially purchase the land in phases over time as they raised the funds, and then eventually transfer it over to the Yurok tribe to actually manage.
Let's look at how they are actually managing it today, because they aren't just, locking a gate and walking away. Out of that 47,000 acres, they carved out roughly 14,790 acres, specifically to create the Blue Creek Salmon Sanctuary.
And this connects directly back to that temperature issue we just discussed with the fish. Blue Creek is one of the most vital cold water tributaries in the entire lower Klamath system.
Oh, so the fish actually use it as a refuge.
Exactly. As the main river heats up to lethal temperatures in the late summer, adult salmon that are migrating upstream will actually turn off the main highway, so to speak, turn into the mouth of Blue Creek, and just hold there. They literally use it as a giant natural refrigerator to lower their core body temperatures before they can continue their journey upstream. So, by securing the timberland all around Blue Creek, the Yurok ensured that the tree canopy over the creek would never be clear-cut, which means the water remains completely shaded, cold, and clean forever.
It is literal biological infrastructure. And the remaining 32,307 acres form what's called the Yurok Tribal Community Forest. They are managing this for sustainable timber harvesting, for the traditional gathering of plants like hazel and bear grass, which are crucial for their basketry, and of course, for wildlife habitat. It is just a stunning reclamation. But let's get into the mechanics of the money.
Ah, yes, the money.
Because recovering 47,000 acres of prime California timberland is extraordinarily expensive.
The financial breakdown is where this entire story gets incredibly complex and really fascinating. The total cost of the Blue Creek project was roughly $70 million.
$70 million, wow.
Yeah. And the Western Rivers Conservancy, through a massive years-long combination of private philanthropy, state grants, and federal conservation funds, was able to cover about $56 million of that total.
Okay, doing the math, that leaves a massive $14 million gap.
Yeah.
So how does a tribe close a gap like that?
Well, this is where we turn heavily to the dossier compiled by Nick McKenzie. McKenzie is such a fascinating lens for this part of the story. Like we mentioned, he started his career as a forester for the U.S. Forest Service, managing federal timberlands. But today, he works deeply in the world of the carbon offset market.
Right.
And he points out in his dossier that a crucial $3.3 million of this land acquisition cost came directly from tribal carbon credit revenue.
Okay, I really want to take our time here, because this is one of the most counterintuitive, complex parts of the source material. How exactly does a tribe leverage an abstract, highly bureaucratic financial instrument to buy physical dirt? Like, how do trees turn into actual checks?
It is a trip to wrap your head around. To understand the how, we have to break down the mechanics of California's cap-and-trade program. Let me try to explain it simply. In California, if you are a massive industrial polluter, say you own an oil refinery or a huge natural gas power plant, the state puts a legal cap on how many tons of greenhouse gases you are allowed to emit each year.
And that cap lowers every year, right? To force them to pollute less over time.
Exactly. Now, if you are that refinery and you want to emit more than your legal allowance for the year, you really only have a few options. You can install incredibly expensive new scrubbers and technology to reduce your emissions at the smokestack, or you can go to the open market and buy a carbon offset.
Okay, so an offset is basically paying someone else, somewhere else in the world, to remove a ton of carbon from the atmosphere on your behalf.
Precisely. And one of the most common, prominent ways to do that is through forestry. Because trees pull carbon out of the air naturally as they grow, and they lock it away, they store it in their wood. So under the California Air Resources Board, which we call CARB, a landowner can legally register their forest as an offset project. If they can legally prove, with reams of data, that they are managing their forest to store more carbon than they otherwise would have under normal logging conditions, the state issues them offset credits. 1 credit equals 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide. The landowner can then take those credits and sell them to the oil refinery for cash.
Okay, so the Yuroks were incredibly aggressive and forward-thinking in utilizing this market. Our sources show that back in 2011, they used state clean water revolving fund loans to buy an initial tract of timberland. Then, in 2013, they became the very first entity in the entire state of California to register a forest offset project under the cap-and-trade program.
They were absolute pioneers in this space. And the scale of this across Indian country just grew exponentially from there. By September 2020, tribes and Alaska Native corporations had received roughly 78.9 million forest offset credits. They accounted for roughly half of all the forest offset credits ever issued in the state's entire program. They literally turned atmospheric carbon into tens of millions of dollars of sovereign capital.
Okay, so the mechanism is clear. Trees store carbon, state issues credits, polluters buy credits, tribes get cash to buy land. But we promise to look at the caveats today. Yeah. And the source material is deeply, fiercely divided on the actual climate integrity of this mechanism.
Yeah. I want to make sure I understand the math here. You're saying the carbon offset isn't just about how many trees are physically standing on the land right now. It's an equation based on a hypothetical scenario.
Precisely. And this is the absolute crux of the debate. The whole concept hinges on a word called additionality.
Additionality.
Right. The core requirement of any carbon offset is that the carbon storage must be additional to what would have happened anyway. You are not getting paid for the carbon you already have sitting there in your trees. You are getting paid for the extra carbon you didn't release compared to a baseline scenario of what would have happened if the program didn't exist. Okay, let me make sure I've got this. So if I own a beautiful forest and I never ever had any intention of cutting it down, maybe I just love the trees, I shouldn't legally be able to get paid for not cutting it down because the climate isn't getting any extra benefit from my actions. The oil refinery is still polluting into the sky, and my trees are doing exactly what they were going to do anyway. So that would be basically phantom carbon.
That is exactly the critique. You nailed it. And that is the red flag being raised by independent climate analysts at organizations like Carbon Plan. And it was detailed in these massive, deep investigative reports by ProPublica. They intensely scrutinize the mathematical baselines that are used in California's forest offset protocol.
Because how do you prove what you would have done?
Exactly. To establish that baseline, the protocol essentially lets the landowner look at regional averages for timber harvesting.
And the investigative reporters argue that those regional averages are fundamentally flawed in practice.
Yes. ProPublica and Carbon Plan argue that the protocol essentially allows landowners to legally claim that their baseline, their worst-case alternative scenario, would be aggressive, maximum legal clear-cutting of the property. But the analysts argue that for many of these specific properties, aggressive clear-cutting was never actually economically viable or practically intended by the owner in the first place.
Because the terrain might be too steep to log? Or the landowner might literally be a conservation group who would never log it anyway.
Right. Therefore, the critics argue the baseline is artificially inflated. It's a fiction. And if the baseline is inflated, the state is issuing millions of offset credits for carbon storage that was naturally going to happen regardless of the money.
Which means the oil refinery gets to keep polluting, but the matching carbon removal that they paid for isn't actually happening. So the atmosphere is taking a net loss. I mean, that is a devastating critique of the accounting. But what is the defense? How does the state of California justify running the program this way?
Well, on the other side of the aisle, you have the California Air Resources Board, CARB. They administer and regulate the whole program, and they strictly, adamantly defend its rigor. CARB argues that you fundamentally cannot base a massive statewide regulatory program on trying to psychoanalyze a landowner or read their mind about their future intentions.
Right. How do you regulate intent?
Exactly, you can't. They argue that the only fair, objective, legally sound way to establish a baseline across thousands of properties is to look at what is legally permissible and economically feasible for that specific class of land in that specific region.
Oh, I see. They're saying, look, if the land is zoned for commercial timber and it is legally possible to clear-cut it, then clear-cutting is a valid legal baseline, regardless of what the current owner claims they feel like doing today.
Exactly, because ownership can change, intentions can change. CARB also points to the massive amount of auditing involved in this. These projects undergo intense third-party verification. The landowner has to sign legally binding contracts committing to actively maintain that carbon storage for 100 years.
100 years is a long time in forestry.
It is. Plus, they have to contribute a percentage of their earned credits into a state buffer pool that acts as basically an insurance policy in case a wildfire burns the forest down and releases the carbon back into the air. So CARB maintains that their methodology is sound and that the climate benefits are real, verified, and permanent.
Okay, so we have a massive, highly technical collision of perspectives here. We have Carbon Plan and ProPublica waving a massive red flag, arguing the baselines are inflated and the climate is suffering. And we have the state regulatory agency defending the legal and mathematical integrity of the system.
All right.
Now, I mean, we are not climate accountants here. We aren't picking a side on whose math is correct. But we have to hold the tension of these two realities at the exact same time.
We really do. Because regardless of the fierce debate over the atmospheric math, the financial math on the ground is undisputed. The sale of those offset credits generated real, tangible, multi-million-dollar capital for the Yurok tribe. And that capital was directly used to pay off the loans that bought back the 47,000 acres of Blue Creek.
It funded roads, it funded housing, it funded tribal youth programs.
Exactly. It's an incredible paradox, honestly. A climate policy that many top experts believe is deeply flawed was the exact mechanism that funded one of the most successful indigenous land reclamations in modern history.
It's fascinating. But, buying fee land Actually owning the deed to a piece of private property is only one piece of this puzzle, because native nations don't exist in a vacuum. They're surrounded by millions and millions of acres of public land that is managed by the federal government.
Which brings us to the next structural shift in our sources. The goal for these tribes isn't just to buy back private land, it's to fundamentally change how public federal forests are managed right next door. And this is the exact shift that Nick McKenzie watched happen firsthand in his career. Moving from native people being managed off the land to native people actively co-managing it.
I want to dig into that history for a second, because we teased the secret treaties earlier in the deep dive. How did the federal government end up controlling all this California land in the first place?
It's a dark history. It goes back to the 1850s, right at the onset of the California Gold Rush. Federal agents came out and negotiated 18 separate treaties with various California tribes. The tribes agreed to cede massive amounts of territory. And in exchange, the federal government guaranteed them roughly 8.5 million acres of protected reservation land.
But those reservations were never actually created.
No, they weren't, because the California state legislature, which was representing all the new gold miners and settlers who wanted unrestricted access to every single inch of the state, they aggressively lobbied the U.S. Senate to reject those treaties outright.
And the Senate listened to them.
They did. But they didn't just reject them, they actually placed them under an injunction of secrecy. The treaties were literally hidden in a locked drawer in Washington, D.C. for over 50 years.
That is just, it's hard to process.
It is. The tribes were violently pushed off their ancestral territories by militias and the military, but they never received the promised legal protections or the promised land. So millions of acres of what was supposed to be tribal land essentially vanished into the federal public domain. And that land eventually became the National Forests and the Bureau of Land Management lands that we all know today.
So for a century, the core strategy of the federal agencies managing those public forests was total suppression. They suppressed the native people, and they suppressed the native ecological practices. But that dynamic is finally changing structurally. Let's talk about the legal mechanisms that are forcing that change today, starting with something called the Tribal Forest Protection Act.
Yeah, the Tribal Forest Protection Act, or the TFPA, was passed in 2004, and it was a crucial inflection point. Imagine a map where a tribal reservation shares a direct border with a massive U.S. national forest. For decades, if that national forest was terribly mismanaged by the feds, if it was choked with dead brush and dying trees, the tribe could do absolutely nothing but watch it pile up.
And when a wildfire inevitably started in that federal forest,
it would sweep right across the border and destroy the tribal land. The tribe was helpless.
So the TFPA essentially gave tribes a legal mechanism to finally say, look, your mismanaged forest is a direct existential threat to our sovereign land. We are going to formally propose a project to clean up your forest, and you have to legally sit down and consider it.
Exactly. It gave tribes a formal, mandated seat at the table to propose stewardship and restoration projects on adjacent federal land. And that foundation has been built upon incredibly rapidly in just the last few years. In 2022 alone, the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the U.S. Forest Service signed 11 new massive tribal co-stewardship agreements.
Wow. And there's another mechanism mentioned in the sources here, too. The Good Neighbor Authority. How does that one work?
The Good Neighbor Authority is basically a brilliant bureaucratic fix. Historically, even if the Forest Service wanted a tribe to come in and thin out a dense stand of federal timber to prevent a fire, the federal contracting bureaucracy made it a nightmare to actually hire them. The Good Neighbor Authority allows the federal government to easily enter into agreements with state, county, and tribal agencies to actually execute the forest management work themselves.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so a tribe can now send its own highly trained forestry crews straight onto federal land, do the critical restoration work, and crucially, they can keep the receipts from the sale of the thin timber to fund even more restoration work.
So the jurisdiction is really blurring here. The federal government still holds the legal title to the dirt, but tribal crews and tribal science are the ones actually managing the ecosystem. But what are they doing differently? If a tribal forestry crew goes onto a national forest, how is their management fundamentally different from what the U.S. Forest Service has been doing for 100 years?
The defining difference comes down to one single word: fire.
Fire.
Specifically, the reintroduction of cultural burning.
Because for a century, the absolute unquestioned dogma of federal forest management was the 10 a.m. policy. Right?
Yes, the infamous 10 a.m. policy. If a fire starts anywhere in a national forest, the absolute mandate was to have it completely extinguished by 10 a.m. the following day. Total absolute suppression. The belief was that all fire is bad.
And we are literally choking on the catastrophic results of that policy today. By suppressing every single small natural fire for 100 years, the federal government essentially allowed massive unnatural amounts of fuel-dead wood, thick underbrush, diseased trees to accumulate on the forest floor.
It's a powder keg. Now, when a fire ignites during a hot, dry summer, it doesn't just burn the brush on the ground like it used to. It climbs what they call the fuel ladder, right up the dead lower branches and into the canopy of the oldest trees. And that creates a massive, uncontrollable mega fire that burns so hot it literally sterilizes the soil.
But the tribal approach, this traditional ecological knowledge that was practiced for millennia before the gold rush even happened, it views fire completely differently. It views it as a tool, not an enemy.
Exactly. For thousands of years, Native peoples all over California used deliberate, low-intensity, prescribed fires to manage the entire landscape. They knew exactly when the humidity and the wind were right to burn safely. They used fire to clear out the accumulated dead brush, which actively prevented those massive, destructive canopy fires.
It's basically forest maintenance.
Yes. And they also used it to stimulate the growth of specific cultural plants, like hazel, for instance, which literally needs fire to produce the straight, flexible shoots that they use in traditional basket weaving. They used fire to clear the understory so hunters could actually see the deer, and to eliminate pests that would ruin their acorn crops. It was highly managed.
And for decades, the federal government criminalized this exact practice. If a Native person was caught lighting a cultural burn on their own ancestral land, they could be arrested and thrown in jail for arson. But now, as part of these new co-management agreements, the federal agencies are actively, desperately asking tribes to bring the fire back.
It is a profound validation of indigenous science. Modern fire ecologists and state agencies like CAL FIRE, they look at the traditional practices now and they emphatically agree. The Native people were right all along. Low-intensity fire is absolutely essential for the biological health and resilience of the forest in California.
Think about the historical weight of that reckoning for a second. The federal government spent a century displacing these people, hiding their treaties in a drawer, outlawing their ecological science, and throwing them in jail. And now, facing an unprecedented crisis of megafires that threaten entire cities, the government is essentially admitting that the people they displaced were the only ones who actually knew how to manage the landscape.
It fundamentally rewrites the relationship. It shifts it from this toxic paternalism to an actual partnership. And this philosophy that a community inherently knows what is best for its own environment, that doesn't stop at the edge of the forest. Because if a tribe has the authority and the deep knowledge to heal the land, they also have the authority to heal their own people.
Which brings us to the next major pillar of our source material today, health sovereignty. Because the federal and state policies dictating Native health care have undergone a transformation that is, honestly, just as radical as the forest management policies.
Oh, definitely. And the bedrock of this transition is a piece of federal legislation from 1975 called the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. Policy wonks usually just call it Public Law 93-638.
What did that law actually do?
Well, before this law, if you went to a clinic on a reservation, it was entirely run, funded, and staffed by the Federal Indian Health Service. The federal government in D.C. decided what medical services were offered, who got hired as a doctor, and exactly how the budget was spent. The tribes had zero say.
So PL 93-638 was basically a mechanism for autonomy.
Exactly. It allowed tribes to formally contract with the federal government to essentially take over the management of those health programs themselves. It gave tribes the legal power to run their own clinics, design their own public health interventions, and actually prioritize the specific, unique needs of their own communities.
In California, this led to the creation of these robust consortiums, right? Like the California Rural Indian Health Board, which advocates for and supports all these tribally run clinics. But even when tribes successfully took over the physical clinic buildings, they were still totally bound by Western bureaucratic definitions of what Medicaid or Medicare would actually agree to pay for.
Right. You might own the building, but if the federal billing codes don't recognize your medical practices, you literally can't afford to offer them. And for generations, the federal government simply did not recognize traditional Native healing practices as real medicine.
In fact, just like the cultural burning we just talked about, traditional healing was historically suppressed and driven underground by federal agents and missionaries. It was seen as a threat.
But the state of California just initiated a landmark shift in how this works. Our sources detail that in 2025, the California Department of Healthcare Services, DHCS, They officially implemented a brand new medical benefit specifically designed to reimburse traditional healthcare practices.
I really want to pause on the irony of this because it is staggering. A century ago, practicing traditional medicine could get a native healer arrested. Today, the state of California has created specific billing codes in the system so that state and federal Medicaid dollars flow directly to reimburse those exact same traditional practices.
It is a massive structural reversal of policy. United Indian Health Services, which is a big tribal health consortium up in Northern California, they became the very first entity in the state to be officially reimbursed under this new program. It formally financially integrates traditional knowledge into the modern healthcare economy.
And alongside recognizing the traditional healing, the sources detail another highly specific, very bureaucratic policy fix that happened in 2025 regarding how Medicaid operates physically. It's known as the four walls fix. And this is a perfect example of where the dry mechanics of policy directly impact human lives on the ground.
Oh, absolutely. To understand the four walls rule, you have to look at how Medicaid was originally designed in the first place. Historically, federal Medicaid rules had this very strict geographic requirement, mostly to prevent fraud. For a medical service to be billable to the government, that service had to be delivered physically inside the four walls of the registered clinic or hospital.
Okay, the analogy I like to use for this to explain how crazy it was in practice. Imagine a rural town buys a state-of-the-art fire truck, okay?
Okay, I'm with you.
It's fully funded, it's fully staffed with paramedics, and it's ready to roll. But there's a bizarre federal law stating that the fire truck is never, ever legally allowed to leave the fire station. So if a house catches fire 10 miles down a dirt road, the townspeople have to somehow figure out how to bring the burning house to the station in order for the firemen to legally put it out.
That is, wow, that is a perfect, terrifying analogy for how the four walls rule actually impacted rural tribal healthcare. Because if you have a great tribal clinic and there is a tribal elder living, say, 40 miles away at the end of a rugged, unpaved reservation road, and they don't have a car, and they desperately need diabetic wound care.
The clinic has the nurses ready to help them.
They do. But under the old rule, if the nurse drove out to the elder's house to treat the wound in their living room, the clinic could not bill Medicaid for the time or the medical materials, simply because the service happened outside the clinic's four physical walls.
It effectively paralyzed the clinics from doing outreach. It forced some of the most geographically isolated, vulnerable populations in the entire country to navigate immense barriers just to get basic preventative care.
Exactly. But after years of intense, grueling advocacy by groups like the National Indian Health Board, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services finally issued new flexibilities that fixed this. The four walls restriction was finally lifted for tribal clinics.
So mechanically, what does that allow them to do now?
It is completely revolutionary for rural medicine. Tribal clinics can now bill Medicaid for care delivered wherever the patient is. It allows them to deploy mobile medical units to remote corners of the reservation. It allows for in-home visits for elders, community-based vaccination drives at the community center, and behavioral health interventions right in the field. It takes the healthcare to the people rather than forcing the people to overcome the geography.
When you combine that kind of bureaucratic flexibility with real sovereign capital, the results are just incredible. And to really see what that looks like in physical space, we need to look at an emblem of this entire movement. We need to travel down to the Sierra foothills, specifically to Tuolumne County.
Yeah, let's introduce the Chicken Ranch Rancheria of Miwok Indians. This is a modest, relatively small gaming tribe located in Jamestown, California.
Now, we've talked about the history of tribal gaming compacts before on deep dives. You know how tribes fought tooth and nail for the sovereign right to operate casinos on their land. And often, the general public's perception of tribal gaming kind of stops at the casino doors. But the Chicken Ranch Rancheria is showing exactly how that gaming revenue is transformed into critical public infrastructure. On July 1st, 2026, they broke ground on an absolutely massive project.
It is huge. It is a 20,000 square foot, $32 million health and wellness facility at the Matheson Memorial Health Clinic. It is slated to open around December 2027, and the funding structure of this building is a perfect reflection of the exact partnerships we've been discussing today.
Right, they didn't just write a $32 million check from the casino vault and call it a day.
No, they didn't. The construction is funded by a really strategic combination of the tribe's own gaming revenue matched with massive state capital. Specifically, they pulled down grants from the DHCS Behavioral Health Continuum Infrastructure Program. So the tribe leveraged its own economic engine to pull down state public health dollars to double their impact.
And the physical design of the building is so deliberate. The architectural blueprints were specifically drawn up to echo the shape and the weave of traditional Miwok medicine baskets.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah. The building itself is a physical manifestation of the culture. But inside those traditional walls is just a powerhouse of modern medical capacity.
The growth metrics are astounding, honestly. Back in 2015, the clinic operated with a staff of just 22 people. By the time this new facility is fully operational in 2026, they expect to employ 101 staff members. They are vastly expanding primary care, they're adding robust behavioral health departments, addiction recovery services, a walk-in urgent care, and specialized pain management.
But here is the real aha moment of the whole project. Here is the detail in the source material that elevates this from a nice story about tribal healthcare to a story about total regional transformation. This $32 million state-of-the-art facility, funded by tribal gaming and state grants, is not restricted to tribal members.
Right.
Its doors are open to the entire community, native and non-native alike.
That is the crucial pivot. We are talking about Tuolumne County here. This is a rural, mountainous region that, like much of rural America right now, suffers from a severe, persistent shortage of doctors and medical specialists.
So mechanically, think about what is happening here. You have a region where the private medical market completely failed to provide adequate care, and where the county government lacked the tax base and the capital to build a massive new hospital. Into that void steps a sovereign native nation. They take the revenue generated from their casino, combine it with state grants, and build a vital public good that serves the very town that surrounds them.
It's amazing. As John Vass, who is the executive director of the clinic, stated at the groundbreaking ceremony, they aren't just opening a building, they are opening a promise. The tribe is essentially saying to the local community, we have the resources, we have the sovereign capacity, and we are going to ensure that everyone living in this region has access to the care they need.
It is a radical act of community building. It turns the historical dynamic completely upside down. A marginalized community becomes the primary benefactor and healthcare provider for the broader region. And that local promise in Jamestown is mirrored by a shifting promise at the macro level, too. The state of California is finally starting to structurally act like a partner rather than a perpetrator.
We saw the clearest articulation of this new state posture in 2024. On June 18, 2024, which was deliberately timed to be the 5th anniversary of Governor Gavin Newsom's formal apology to Native peoples for the state's historical role in their suppression and violence, the administration announced a historic suite of actual land return initiatives.
This is where the apologies finally meet actual capital. The governor didn't just offer words this time. The administration launched the Tribal Nature-Based Solutions Grant Program. We are talking about a $100 million fund aimed specifically at providing tribes with the capital to reacquire their ancestral lands.
And this ties directly into the state's broader environmental agenda. California has a mandate, known as 30 by 30, to conserve 30% of its lands and coastal waters by 2030. The state is formally recognizing that the most effective way to reach that conservation goal is to return land to the tribes who managed it sustainably for millennia.
And all of this material restoration, the grants, the land transfers, the co-management agreements, it's all happening alongside the ongoing, deeply complex work of the California Truth and Healing Council. The state is attempting to formally document the historical record of violence and dispossession, even as it tries to build the legal mechanisms for return.
However, as we promised at the very beginning of this deep dive, we cannot just end on a triumphant note and roll the credits. We have to look at the structural vulnerabilities of everything we've just discussed. We have to name the honest doubts.
Right, because $100 million sounds like a lot of money to you and me, but in the California commercial real estate market, it disappears incredibly quickly. Let's engage in a merit analysis of the caveats here. The first major question our sources raise is about scale. We spend a lot of time breaking down that 47,000-acre Blue Creek land-back deal. Is that model actually replicable for other tribes?
That is a very, very difficult question to answer affirmatively, because the Blue Creek acquisition was an extraordinary, almost anomalous alignment of factors.
Right.
First, it required a massive, continuous swath of private timberland to actually be available for purchase from a willing seller.
Right, you can't buy it if it's not for sale.
Exactly. Second, it relied on a highly capable, very well-funded conservation intermediary in the Western Rivers Conservancy to negotiate and actually hold the land for over a decade while funds were raised. And crucially, it relied on the Yurok tribe having the advanced institutional capacity, the legal teams, and the forestry experts to navigate the incredibly dense bureaucracy of the carbon market to generate millions in offset revenue.
So if you are a smaller tribe and you don't have a massive private forest next door, you don't have an NGO partner, and you don't have a team of carbon accountants on staff, how do you buy your land back?
That is the exact friction point. It may not be a universally scalable model, and that ties directly into the second major doubt highlighted in the sources, the profound rural wealth divide across Indian country.
This is a critical point. We've talked about gaming revenue building $32 million clinics in Tuolumne County and carbon credit revenue buying back mountains in the Klamath Basin. But those specific revenue streams are highly concentrated.
Yes, they are. They are concentrated among a minority of well-positioned tribes. A tribe located near a major population center or a major highway can generate immense gaming revenue. A tribe with vast, intact, historically tribal forests can generate carbon capital, but there are dozens of other tribes in California, many of whom are completely landless or located in highly remote areas without the geography to support a casino or a carbon project, who remain incredibly cash poor.
The sovereign gains we've discussed today are very real and they're completely transformative, but they are undeniably uneven. The success of the Yurok or the Chicken Ranch Rancheria does not magically translate to economic stability for a landless tribe in a different valley. And the third caveat we have to examine is political durability, because none of these mechanisms exist in a vacuum.
No, they don't. All of these co-management agreements, these massive state funding streams, the Good Neighbor Authority contracts, they rely entirely on the political will of the current state and federal administrations.
Right, like what happens if a new governor is elected in California who just doesn't prioritize the 30 by 30 conservation goals, and they just slash the budget for the tribal nature-based solutions grants? Or what happens if a new federal administration appoints leaders to the Department of Agriculture who believe in aggressive timber extraction, and they just revoke all the tribal co-stewardship agreements in the national forests?
It is a genuinely unsettled question. The bureaucratic mechanisms are in place, but, bureaucratic mechanisms can be dismantled by the next guy in charge. Whether these hard-won arrangements and funding streams can survive the inevitable shifting of political winds over the next decade is the ultimate test of their durability.
So we have undeniable systemic progress, but it is deeply shattered by real vulnerability. Let's try to bring all of this together. We've tracked a massive amount of information today. What is the final synthesis of this enormous historical arc?
Well, if you step back and look at the entire journey documented in these sources, from the hidden, unratified treaties of 1851 through a century of forced assimilation and total fire suppression, all the way to the realities of 2026. The defining takeaway is that self-determination has transitioned from a mere legal theory into hard physical infrastructure.
It's no longer just a demand written on a protest sign. It is real. It is a free-flowing Klamath River with salmon spawning above the rubble of a concrete dam. It is a doubled land base in the deep forests of Blue Creek. It is tribal biologists out on the water authoring the science.
It is tribal forestry crews holding good neighbor contracts, deciding where the fire should go to actually heal the woods. And it is a $32 million clinic with its doors wide open, promising healthcare to an entire rural county.
Despite all the caveats, despite the persistent wealth divides and the looming political uncertainties, the fundamental reality on the ground has changed. Native people in California have genuinely mechanically moved from being managed off the land to co-managing it. It is an incredibly powerful inversion of history.
Which brings us to our final thought.
Yes, it does.
As you process all the technical mechanisms and historical shifts we've unpacked today, I want to leave you with one lingering question to mull over. We've seen how modern, highly bureaucratic systems like compliance, carbon offset markets, or federal Medicaid billing codes, or state casino compact systems that were fundamentally built by Western institutions for the purposes of extraction, regulation, and control. They have been cleverly hacked and inverted by tribes to fund actual physical restoration and community health.
They took the master's tools and used them to rebuild their own house.
Exactly. So the question is, if a system built on extraction can be successfully repurposed as an engine for historical repair, what other broken modern systems out there in our economy, in our legal framework, in our environmental policies might just be waiting to be hacked, inverted, and used to heal the very damage they originally caused?
That is an incredible lens to view the world through. You picture those fall-run Chinook salmon swimming past the muddy footprint of a century-old concrete dam, and you realize sometimes the map isn't permanent. Sometimes the blockade actually comes down. And sometimes, with enough relentless persistence and tactical brilliance, the river actually does run free again. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. Keep exploring the mechanisms around you, keep looking for the systems that can be inverted, and keep questioning the world.